Napoleon Bonaparte was once the most powerful man in Europe. He crowned himself Emperor of France, led armies that redrew maps, toppled thrones, and humbled kingdoms. His strategies were studied, his victories legendary, and his very name became synonymous with ambition. He seemed unstoppable, a man destined to shape the world in his own image. But his end was not the glorious charge of a cavalry across the battlefield, nor the noble death of a general in the heart of war. It was far quieter, far lonelier. It was a slow unraveling, physical pain gnawing at him, suspicion poisoning his mind, and exile stripping him of everything he had once commanded. Napoleon's death was not just biological decay, it was psychological torment. And even now, 2 centuries later, the truth behind how he died is still fiercely debated. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon's empire crumbled for the last time. He had once escaped from exile on Elba, returned to France, and rebuilt his power in a matter of days during the 100 Days. But after Waterloo, there would be no miraculous return. Hounded by enemies, abandoned by allies, and with Paris occupied, Napoleon surrendered to the British, believing they might grant him mercy. Some accounts suggest he hoped to be exiled to America, to live quietly far from Europe's politics. The British had other plans. They feared his charisma, his ability to inspire revolutions even from afar. So they chose a prison unlike any other, St. Helena. St. Helena sits in the South Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,000 miles from Africa, even farther from South America. Remote, wind-lashed, and surrounded by jagged cliffs, it was chosen precisely because escape was impossible. To reach Europe from St. Helena was to cross an ocean patrolled by the Royal Navy. Napoleon had been caged in a paradise he could not leave. At first glance, the island was green, dotted with valleys and steep ridges, but life there was suffocating for a man who once commanded continents. He was housed at Longwood House, a structure meant for soldiers, not emperors. Damp and drafty, it leaked during storms and grew mold on the walls. Rats scurried across the floors at night. The food was often stale or meager, hardly fit for a prisoner, let alone a man who had dined in royal courts. The isolation was complete, the conditions humiliating. Napoleon was under constant surveillance. British guards shadowed his movements, his letters were read before being sent, and he was forbidden from venturing too far from his residence. He complained bitterly in letters that even his walks felt like those of a prisoner pacing in a yard. This was no dignified exile, it was designed to break him body and spirit. Over the years, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate. By 1817, just 2 years into his exile, he was plagued with stomach pain and fatigue. He complained of nausea, vomiting, and difficulty eating. By the following year, his condition worsened. He grew weak, his legs swollen, his skin tinged yellow. The once fiery emperor who had thundered across battlefields now spent hours reclining on a worn sofa. His speech weakened to a whisper. At times he could not stand without help. Visitors described him as bloated, sluggish, and aged beyond his years. Napoleon occupied his remaining energy with writing. He composed memoirs, reflections on his campaigns, and long letters to his son, the King of Rome. But his handwriting grew shaky, his arguments meandering. The man who once commanded with clarity and precision now drifted between lucidity and fatigue. And then came the fear. Whispered suspicions that consumed him in his final years. Napoleon became convinced that he was being poisoned by the British. He told his companions at Longwood that the food, the wine, even the air itself was being tampered with. He accused Governor Hudson Lowe, the man responsible for guarding him, of orchestrating a slow death. Many of his supporters dismissed this as paranoia, the ravings of a sick man trapped in endless isolation. Yet decades later, his suspicions took on a chilling new dimension. In the 1960s, scientists tested strands of Napoleon's hair preserved from the time of his death. The results were startling. They revealed unusually high levels of arsenic, a poison that in small doses could cause exactly the symptoms he suffered: gastrointestinal pain, weakness, and gradual organ failure. This discovery reignited debates. Had the British deliberately poisoned their most dangerous prisoner, preferring a quiet death to the risk of escape or rescue? Or was it accidental, the result of arsenic-laced dyes in the wallpaper at Longwood, which was known to mold and release toxic fumes in the damp climate? Some even speculated his companions, desperate for inheritance or influence, might have had a hand in his decline. On May 5, 1821, after 6 years in exile, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. His final words, by most accounts, were a fading murmur of France, the army, Joséphine. He had not seen his homeland since 1815. An autopsy was performed by French and British doctors. The official report listed stomach cancer as the cause of death. Napoleon's father had died of the same illness, lending weight to the hereditary explanation. But whispers of poisoning never fully faded, especially with the later discovery of arsenic in his hair. Napoleon's end was both fitting and tragic. For a man who had towered over Europe, exile on a remote island was the ultimate humiliation. His enemies feared his legend more than his armies. They believed his very existence was a threat to peace. And so they chose isolation over execution, allowing him to live, but ensuring he would fade away unseen, unheeded, and in agony. Yet even in death, Napoleon refused to vanish quietly. His body was exhumed in 1840 and returned to France, where crowds filled the streets of Paris to honor him. His tomb in Les Invalides stands as a monument not just to his victories, but also to his enduring mystery. Did Napoleon die of cancer, following the same fate as his father? Was he slowly poisoned, either deliberately or by accident? The evidence remains tangled, the truth uncertain, but perhaps that is fitting. For Napoleon's life was defined by enigma, ambition, and the clash between myth and reality. His death, like his reign, became a story the world could not stop retelling. From the palaces of Paris to the lonely, rat-infested halls of Longwood House, Napoleon Bonaparte's life traced the extremes of power and despair. He was an emperor who crowned himself, a conqueror who redrew Europe, and a prisoner who died in isolation. His end was not a glorious charge, but it was no less unforgettable. Because in the end, the man who had once ruled millions was reduced to the same frailty as any other, haunted by pain, suspicion, and the inescapable shadow of mortality. Napoleon Bonaparte was once the master of Europe, a man who crowned himself emperor, led armies across continents, and reshaped nations with the force of his will. Yet his end was not a blaze of glory on the battlefield, nor a defiant last stand in front of cannons. Instead, it came in a crumbling house on a remote island, in silence, suspicion, and pain. For centuries, his death has been surrounded by mystery, and when the first scientific tests on his preserved hair revealed high levels of arsenic, the debate over whether he died of natural causes or deliberate murder ignited with new fury. Arsenic was one of the most feared poisons of the 19th century. Colorless, tasteless, and slow in its effects, it could kill without leaving obvious traces, particularly when administered in small doses over a long period. It caused agonizing nausea, internal bleeding, organ failure, and neurological decline. Its symptoms were cruelly familiar to those who knew Napoleon's condition in his final years on St. Helena. Chronic stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, hallucinations, brittle nails, hair loss, swelling in the legs, and sudden mood swings. Every one of these was written in the emperor's slow decline. This discovery seemed to confirm what Napoleon himself had feared all along. He often told his followers that the British were poisoning him. He complained bitterly of the taste of his water and wine. He refused meals at times, and he accused his jailer, Governor Sir Hudson Lowe, of orchestrating a slow assassination. To Lowe, these accusations were nothing more than the paranoia of a fallen conqueror, a man stripped of his power and stewing in bitterness. Yet the laboratory results suggested otherwise. Multiple strands of Napoleon's hair, carefully preserved as mementos by his loyal followers and passed down through generations, were tested in modern laboratories. To the surprise of scientists, they all revealed unusually high levels of arsenic, sometimes as much as 10 times the normal amount. This was no fleeting exposure. It pointed to consistent, prolonged contact. Not enough to kill him in days, but enough to make him suffer for years. Enough to hasten his decline. Enough to ensure that if he ever hoped for recovery, it would never come. The question then became unavoidable: was this deliberate murder, or could it have been an environmental accident? Arsenic was far more common in the early 19th century than it is today. It was used in dyes, cosmetics, medicine, and even in food preservation. Wallpaper in particular often contained arsenic-based pigments that, in damp conditions, could break down into toxic gas. Longwood House, the decaying residence where Napoleon spent his exile, had green wallpaper coated with arsenic. The moldy, humid climate of St. Helena could have released arsenic vapors into the air Napoleon breathed every day. If so, he may have been poisoned not by assassins, but by his own walls. Yet many historians remain skeptical of this explanation. The levels of arsenic found in Napoleon's hair were far higher than what could be explained by wallpaper alone. More importantly, Napoleon's political enemies had strong motives for ensuring his death. Even in exile, he remained a symbol of resistance. In France, royalists feared his legend might spark a coup. In Britain, leaders worried that he might escape and reignite war. Austria and Prussia, once humbled by him, had no desire to see him alive and stirring trouble. The safest way to secure the peace of Europe was to ensure that Napoleon never returned. That brings suspicion to one man in particular, Count Charles de Montholon. He was one of the few allowed to remain close to Napoleon on St. Helena. Officially, he was a loyal follower, but his past revealed a man of shifting loyalties. He had served different masters during the Napoleonic Wars and had suspicious access to Napoleon's meals and wine. Some historians suggest that if arsenic was administered deliberately, Montholon may have been the hand that delivered it, whether on his own initiative or at the bidding of others. But even if poison played a role, it was not the only shadow over Napoleon's health. His autopsy in 1821 revealed a stomach riddled with ulcers and dominated by a large, cancerous tumor. The reports described tissue so deteriorated that even water could not be swallowed without pain. The bleeding was severe, the growth extensive, and his father had died of stomach cancer years before, suggesting a hereditary link. Many doctors today argue that cancer, not poison, was the direct cause of death. Still, cancer alone cannot explain everything. The mental disturbances, the dramatic changes in his hair and nails, and the years of weakness before the cancer became fatal all point to an additional factor, likely chemical. The truth may be that both forces worked together: a body destroyed by cancer and a system weakened and tormented by arsenic exposure. Beyond the physical agony, Napoleon endured a psychological torment just as cruel. His captivity was designed to humiliate him. Governor Hudson Lowe denied him the title of emperor, instead addressing him as general, stripping away his dignity. Guards shadowed him constantly, even during private walks. His correspondence was censored and delayed for months, cutting him off from family and political allies. French books and newspapers were denied to him, leaving him starved of the culture and identity that had defined his life. His home was damp, rat-infested, and barely fit for a man of his station. It was not simply imprisonment. It was erasure. As his body failed, so too did his spirit. The man who once commanded armies across Europe was reduced to a frail figure scribbling memoirs by candlelight, coughing blood into his handkerchiefs, and whispering about betrayal. He never stopped believing that he was being murdered. In one of his final letters, he declared, I die before my time, killed by the English oligarchy and their hired assassin. To the very end, he saw himself not as a man succumbing to illness, but as a victim of calculated vengeance. Whether by cancer poison or the cruelty of exile, Napoleon Bonaparte's death was not noble. It was not swift, nor was it befitting the emperor who once bent nations to his will. It was quiet, agonizing, and humiliating. The world remembers his victories and his conquests, but his final years were marked by decline, suspicion, and suffering. And perhaps that was the point. For his enemies, it was not enough to defeat Napoleon on the battlefield. He had to be broken, erased, and left to die in obscurity. Far from the throne he once claimed, far from the cities he once ruled, and far from the soldiers who once cheered his name. In the end, his death remains a mystery unresolved. Was he poisoned? Was it cancer? Or was it both? Disease aided by human malice? We may never know for certain. But one truth is undeniable: the emperor who once seemed invincible was undone, not by gunfire or glory, but by a slow, lonely, and excruciating decline on an island built to break him. By early 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte was a shell of the man who had once commanded Europe with iron will and dazzling charisma. His once powerful frame had withered, his eyes had lost their piercing fire, and even his voice, once booming and capable of rallying armies, was reduced to a raspy whisper that barely carried across the room. The body that had endured decades of war, assassination attempts, and the merciless Russian winter now struggled simply to survive the passing of each hour. Longwood House, his decaying prison on the remote island of St. Helena, had become less a home and more a tomb in waiting. Its walls were damp, its ceilings leaky, and its air heavy with mold. Rats skittered across the floorboards at night, and the wallpaper itself was rumored to be laced with poison. To the outside world, St. Helena was a distant island of exile. To Napoleon, it was a coffin surrounded by an ocean, in which he waited to be lowered into the earth. By then, he rarely left his bed. Each movement was met with waves of gnawing pain in his abdomen, pain that twisted and stabbed without reprieve. Almost everything he ate was vomited back up. His hands trembled as if belonging to an old man twice his age, his legs were grotesquely swollen, his gums blood, and his once olive-toned skin had turned the color of old parchment. Visitors who entered his chambers were struck not only by the sight of his decline, but also by the smell of rot that seemed to emanate from his very body. Napoleon Bonaparte, the conqueror of Europe, was dying, and he knew it. Yet what made his decline truly horrifying was not only the relentless physical agony. It was the sense of abandonment, of being erased, of being deliberately forgotten. This was the man who had once stood on the steps of Notre Dame Cathedral and placed the crown of an emperor upon his own head before the eyes of the Pope. He had dictated the fate of kings and redrawn the map of Europe. But now he lay in a rotting house on a forgotten island, his empire reduced to bitter memories scribbled in letters and memoirs. The cruelty of his captors deepened the torment. Sir Hudson Lowe, the British governor of St. Helena, refused to show Napoleon even the most basic mercy. Requests for better food, for improved living conditions, for even a shred of dignity were denied. To Lowe, Napoleon was no longer emperor, but merely General Bonaparte, stripped of the title that had once made kings bow their heads. To a man like Napoleon, whose entire being was built on power, honor, and image, this denial was not petty. It was a slow, grinding psychological death before the physical one. His mind, once razor-sharp, began to drift. He often spoke to ghosts. His mother, his son, long, dead soldiers who had once cheered him in victory. At times he would wake in a panic, calling for aides who had been gone for years. He wept for his son, the King of Rome, a child he had not seen in nearly a decade. He pleaded to be remembered as a man who had loved France, only to turn moments later to rage, cursing his enemies and railing against betrayal. His mind wavered between lucidity and delirium. But one thing never left him: his obsession with legacy. By the spring of 1821, his decline accelerated. Witnesses described how he vomited thick, black fluid, likely the result of internal bleeding. His sheets were stained dark, his gums bled constantly, and his stomach could no longer digest even the simplest broth. His physician, Dr. Francesco Antomarchi, noted that Napoleon's skin had grown clammy, his heartbeat erratic, and his breathing shallow. The once indomitable emperor was reduced to a man gasping for life. On April 15, he dictated his will. His words were shaky but determined. He left money to his soldiers, cursed those he believed had betrayed him, and insisted that everything he had done was in the name of France. Above all, he requested to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the people I loved. But his captors would not allow it. Britain decreed that he would be buried on St. Helena, thousands of miles away from his homeland. Even in death, he would remain a prisoner. As May approached, storms gathered both over the island and within his failing body. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon slipped into a coma. He had refused confession, still bitter toward the church that had abandoned him in exile. He lay in his bed, his skin soaked with sweat, his breath rattling in his chest. Those who remained by his side bent low to hear his final words, whispered between long silences and painful gasps. France Army, head of the Army Josephine. At just after 500 p.m., the man who had once controlled the destiny of Europe was gone. There was no national salute, no mourning crowds, no triumphant funeral march. Only a handful of loyal officers stood over his body, silently weeping as they closed his eyes. Out of fear that his tomb might become a shrine to rebellion, the British sealed his body in not one, but 4 coffins: tin, mahogany, lead, and finally ebony. It was less a burial than an attempt to cage him even in death. His grave was marked by nothing more than a nameless stone in the Valley of the Willows. No title, no grandeur, no mention of his empire, and for a time it seemed his enemies had succeeded in erasing him. But Napoleon was never truly forgotten. Rumors of his poisoning spread across Europe. Debates about his final illness, the suspicious findings of his autopsy, and the cruelty of his exile kept his memory alive. To some he became a martyr, to others a tyrant, but to all he remained unforgettable. In 1840, nearly 2 decades after his lonely death, France demanded his return. His remains were exhumed and transported back to Paris in a ceremony of grandeur and reverence. Cannons fired, crowds wept, and his body was placed beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides. At last, the emperor had come home. Yet the memory of his final years, the rot of Longwood House, the pain of his body, the humiliation of exile, lingered as a cruel counterpoint to his golden tomb. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once reshaped the world, did not die as a hero nor as a king. He died coughing blood into his sheets, tormented by pain, abandoned in exile, reduced to a shadow of himself. It was not the death of glory. It was not the death of an emperor. It was the death of a man who had once conquered empires, and who, in the end, was left to fade into darkness. Though Napoleon Bonaparte had died, his death continued to raise disturbing questions that would haunt Europe for over a century. The world had witnessed the fall of a titan, but not in a way anyone expected. His end was not a blaze of glory or a battlefield farewell. It was a decay, a slow, painful undoing that felt more like punishment than passing. And for many, it felt planned. Decades after his death, the theories about his final days intensified, particularly surrounding the strange presence of arsenic in his hair. Scientists in the 20th century, using advanced atomic spectroscopy, confirmed that Napoleon's body contained far more arsenic than a normal person would ever encounter. It was not a trace amount. It was systemic, ingrained in every strand of hair they tested. This was not exposure to one poisoned drink. It was long-term, repeated dosing. The question was no longer, was he poisoned? The question became, who did it? The list of suspects is long. Some believe the British had every reason to want him dead. Even exiled, Napoleon remained a symbol of resistance. Revolutionary France had not disappeared. It had simply gone quiet. There were constant fears that Bonapartist loyalists would rise again. As long as Napoleon lived, even imprisoned, his name was enough to light a fire in Europe. Killing him quietly avoided a second war. Others point to the French royalists. Napoleon had destroyed the monarchy, humiliated kings, and built a republic, turned empire on the ashes of noble blood. When the Bourbon dynasty was restored after his fall, the idea that he might return, or that his son might take the throne one day, was a constant threat. Removing Napoleon erased that threat forever. And then there is the most sinister theory that the poisoner was not an enemy at all, but someone close to him. Count Charles de Montholon had access to Napoleon's food, drink, and medicine. He stayed behind when others left. He gained wealth after Napoleon's death and lived comfortably in France, far better off than one would expect. Montholon was accused of treachery multiple times in his life and was known for shifting loyalties. If someone had paid him to slip arsenic into the emperor's wine or food slowly over time, he would have had every opportunity and little reason not to. Some even suggest that Montholon was working for both French and British authorities. A double agent, silently delivering the slow death that no bullet could achieve. But the horror of Napoleon's death was not just who killed him. It was how deeply the suffering went. Autopsy records, combined with modern medical interpretations, show a combination of gastric cancer, arsenic poisoning, and ulcerated intestines. His stomach lining had almost completely disintegrated. His liver was swollen. His blood vessels had burst in his abdomen. The black vomit described by witnesses was most likely the result of internal bleeding mixed with bile and decay. Pain. Non-stop crawling, burning pain. That was the final battle Napoleon fought, alone, in silence, with no enemy to face but his own failing body. There is another strange twist. Napoleon's body, when exhumed in 1840 for the return to France, was reportedly found to be in a remarkable state of preservation. Eyewitnesses said that his features were unchanged, and his hands still looked almost lifelike. This added more fuel to the arsenic theory. Arsenic is known to slow decomposition, so even in death, the poison may have remained inside him, preserving him like a cursed relic. His funeral procession in Paris was massive. Over 1 million people lined the streets. The man who died on a rat-infested island now lay under golden domes and marble statues. But for many, that honor came too late.